Welcome to day 23 out of 24 stories. Tonight's story is kind of a Christmas one. But tonight's bedtime story is called Mr. Men and the Tooth Fairy, written by the same artists. Little Miss Curious was the sort of person who wanted to know everything. She was the sort of person who asked impossible questions. Questions like, what does a tickle look like? Although, we know the answer to that one, don't we? Miss Curious lived in a curious-shaped cottage next door to an ordinary-shaped cottage. And in the ordinary-shaped cottage there lived a little boy called George. George and Miss Curious were good friends. They sat down in the garden together under the apple tree and wondered about things. They wondered about things like, why do trees have bark but don't go woof? Oh, wait a minute. There we are. And things like, why do trees have trunks but they don't have tusks? Not very long ago, the friends met under the apple tree, and on this day, George has something excited to tell Miss Curious. Look, he grinned broadly. I've lost my first tooth. How strange, said Miss Curious. I wonder why teeth fall out. It's to make space for your big teeth to grow, George explained. I'm going to put my tooth under the pillow tonight. Why are you going to do that? Asked Miss Curious. So that the Tooth Fairy will come and take my tooth and put a coin in its place, replied George. I wonder what the Tooth Fairy looks like, asked Miss Curious. George didn't know. I wonder where the Tooth Fairy lives. Again, George didn't know. What a lot of questions needing answers, said Miss Curious. Now you have made me very curious. Give me a minute. After lunch, Miss Curious met Mr. Muddle. Hi, Mr. Muddle, she said. Do you know what the Tooth Fairy looks like? Yellow feathers and a beak, replied Mr. Muddle. Miss Curious was sure that this was not the right answer. Later that day, she met Mr. Wrong. Hello, Mr. Wrong, she said. I was wondering, do you know where the Tooth Fairy lives? In a tree, replied Mr. Wrong. Miss Curious was sure that this was not the right answer either. Give me a minute. So that night, Miss Curious stayed awake, and sometime after midnight, when everybody else was sleeping, Miss Curious saw a soft green glow bobbing about outside George's window. It was the Tooth Fairy. So that's what the Tooth Fairy looks like, Miss Curious said to herself. She followed the Tooth Fairy to another house, and this time she was able to peek through the window to see what happened next. She watched as the Tooth Fairy took a coin from her purse, reached under a little boy's pillow, and pulled out the tooth the sleeping boy had left there before he went to bed. The more Miss Curious watched the fairy at her work, the more curious she became. Miss Curious followed the Tooth Fairy from house to house until the first light of morning. She had to run to keep up. As the sky began to lighten, the Tooth Fairy flew away towards a wood. And in the middle of the wood there was a clearing. And in the middle of the clearing was a tree. A very tall tree. The Tooth Fairy flew up into the tree. And of course Miss Curious, being the curious person she was, had to follow. As the sun rose higher in the sky, she climbed higher in the tree. Higher and higher rose the sun. Up and up went Miss Curious, until there in the topmost branches of the tree she saw a miniature tree house. Miss Curious peeked through the window and saw a little chair, a little table, and a little bed. And there was the little fairy brushing her teeth. So now Miss Curious knew what the Tooth Fairy looked like, and she saw where the Tooth Fairy lived. Her curiosity was satisfied, so she went home. But on her way home she had a thought, a puzzling thought that, not surprisingly, made her curious. She went to Mr. Wrong's house. "You are clever. How did you know the Tooth Fairy lives in a tree?" she asked. "Was I right?" exclaimed Mr. Wrong. "How remarkable! I'm never right. Normally, I am left," which left Miss Curious more curious than ever. Now tomorrow is a very special story. You'll have to find out. Ho, ho, ho. See you tomorrow. Hoo, hoo.